In the past couple of years, the horror genre has seen newfound success with both its fans and film critics, mostly due to films that have been labeled as elevated horror. Films like Get Out, Hereditary, The Witch, and I would even say things like It Follows have breathed new life into a genre that was considered cheap, exploitative, and lacking quality in the early 2000s. Even though the films I mentioned don't have many thematic similarities, they and other similar films of the past decade often use the conventions and tropes of horror to show more or less real problems a person can face, and they cover their themes in a more serious, artistic manner. For example, Get Out deals with the problems of racism in contemporary United States, while Hereditary, through Allegory, shows the lives of a family dealing with mental health problems, which are often, as the title suggests, hereditary. Although a certain portion of horror films are just a spectacle for the sake of a spectacle, I would argue that there have always been horror films that dealt with problems and fears of their times. I also find the term elevated horror a bit snobbish, colored by elitism and the not like the other girls mindset. Also, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but The Witch is one of the most mind-numbingly boring films of the past decade. While on the other hand, Jordan Peele's and Ari Aster's works I will often mention as my favorite films of the year that they were released in. Basically, I'm trying to say that just because something is labeled as elevated horror, it does not mean that you will like it, nor that you have to like it. The slasher subgenre, in its most basic of concepts, has a killer whose identity is sometimes unknown, killing or trying to kill the protagonists of the story. Even though it wasn't the first, John Carpenter's Halloween is considered to have defined the slasher genre. It set up a formula that many other films will try to replicate, often lacking any depth in its execution. Friday the 13th. For the upper middle class of the United States in the 70s, Halloween represented the most terrifying thing they could think of. Horror in their American dream-defined suburbs. And not only that, but it was a horror that could not be explained. Carpenter possibly inadvertently added something to the horror genre that would spark a discussion and a possibly feminist note to its film. The Final Girl. Carol Clover was the first to define the Final Girl. Essentially, the Final Girl is a female character that survives until the end of the film, sometimes being the only person that survives, possibly also beating the antagonist in the process. The antagonist is often male, trying to kill its victims with phallic weapons. Lots of possible symbolism there, as you can imagine. The Final Girl was adopted by many other filmmakers in the horror genre, adding a feminist note to the entire genre that often has the problem of exploitation or sexploitation of its actresses, excess nudity, and so on, which really aren't just problems of the horror genre, but Hollywood in its entirety. Now, why am I saying all of this? Well, to show you that horror films have always had the characteristic of tackling fears and issues of their times. It's not a new thing for the genre. The only thing that differs really is the execution, with the newer films taking themselves very seriously. A horror film that I find to be a perfect example of being more than just, well, a spectacle for the sake of a spectacle, and that is rich with themes that were intended to be in the film, is Wes Craven's 1984 film, A Nightmare on Elm Street. In my viewing of the film, knowing the background of how the film was conceived, A Nightmare on Elm Street is an allegory of trauma, and the different ways in which one can deal with it.
About trauma. It's a movie about trauma. The movie is about trauma.
I doubt you have not seen the film if you're watching this video essay, but Nightmare focuses on a group of teenagers, Nancy, Glenn, Rod, and Tina, that live on the titular Elm Street, who are haunted in their dreams by a certain Fred Krueger, or, well, Freddy. If Freddy hurts or kills them while they're dreaming, they get hurt or die in real life. The subtext that I see in this film is often contributed to the second film of the franchise, which I will also cover, where Freddy is the embodiment of trauma caused by the repression of a gay man's sexuality. Sex and sexuality can often be themes in horror films. However, they're not very relevant to the first Nightmare film. As I've already mentioned, trauma represents the main motif of this film. Craven, when talking about the inception of the Nightmare film, mentioned three main points of inspiration. First is a traumatic event that happened to him when he was a child. Quote, Freddy began as a real-life man who woke me when I was around 10. We lived in a second-story apartment in Cleveland, and my bedroom window overlooked the street. There was muttering and shuffling out there, so I went to the window. An old man dressed in a long overcoat and felt hat was approaching, and when he got under my window, he stopped dead in his tracks and looked straight towards my window. I jumped back into the shadows and waited for him to go. After what seemed like an eternity, I looked again. He was still there, and thrust his head forward with an "I can see you" leer, looking directly into my eyes. Then he started for the entrance of our building, looking over his shoulder at me the whole time. I ran to our apartment door and listened. The door to the street opened. I woke my big brother, and he ran out with a baseball bat, and the man was gone. But he stayed with me too. End quote. Other than the clear visual inspiration for Freddy Krueger's design, this man represented the trauma that happened to Craven when he was young. Craven was aware of the impact this had on him, especially given that the man returned to him in his dreams. Quote, "Studying psychology in college, I was fascinated by Freud's and Jung's exploration of dreams, and I began keeping dream journals. It wasn't long before dreams were as much part of my reality as waking life. After years of this, I began to be aware I was dreaming while still in the dream, and with that, I began writing my own dreams. My life soon doubled in scope." End quote. The second reference point that he mentioned was a story in a newspaper he read. Quote, "About 4 films into my career as a maker of scary movies, I happened across a newspaper story of a young man in Los Angeles who had suffered from nightmares in which he was pursued by a monstrous man intent on killing him. So real were the dreams that this kid decided to stop sleeping. He stayed awake a day, 2 days, 3, 4, until his family worried for his very sanity. His father, a physician, gave him sleeping pills, and finally, one evening, while watching TV with his family, he at last fell asleep. His father carried him to his bedroom and tucked him in. The family went to bed thinking the crisis was finally over. Then, in the middle of the night, they heard him screaming. They rushed to his room to see him trashing on his bed. Before they got to him, he fell still and was dead. An autopsy found no physical harm. His father discovered the uningested sleeping pills. His mother found a long extension cord that led to a coffee maker in the boy's closet, full of hot black coffee. That was all I needed. I sat down and began to write. There would be a girl, Nancy, ordinary on the surface but heroic to the bone. She would know what everyone else was denying, that there was a monstrous human, like in a horror film. But this man was not masked behind leather or plastic, but by his own scarred face, the evidence of what Nancy's parents and their friends did to him. His wardrobe, as seen from a Cleveland window. His weapon, a combination of the most miraculous thing, the human hand, and the most nightmarish, the primal claws of an eternal predator. As for his name, the name of the worst bully I knew in grade school was Freddy." End quote. So, the inspiration behind Freddy Krueger all stem from childhood or teenagehood traumas, whether they were Craven's or not. Craven's horror films often revolve around families, and its impact on a person. The fact that our view of the world, and thus our first fears, developing when we're surrounded by our family, which can often make the situation worse, Craven saw as an inescapable horror of the human experience. Who or what even is Freddy Krueger? A couple of years before the beginning of the story of the film, Krueger was accused of killing several children, but he did not receive any legal punishment due to a technicality during the trial. Because of this, the parents of the murdered children banded together and killed Krueger. The protagonists of the film are the kids of these parents, who are burdened with the consequences of their parents' actions. When Krueger starts going after the teens, Nancy's and Glenn's parents ignore their kids' problems. None of the teenagers can rely on the help of their parents in order to survive. And to make matters worse, direct negligence of the parents leads to the death of at least 2 characters, Tina and Glenn. We could technically also include Rod here. The interesting thing about this film is that we actually never get the confirmation that Freddy did kill those kids all those years ago, which adds another layer to the story. The possibility that the parents killed an innocent man adds another terrifying layer to the story, given that Freddy, in afterlife enacts revenge on the parents' innocent children. Obviously, Freddy's backstory is given in later sequels, rendering this reading of the film somewhat incorrect, but if we only focus on this film, we see a clear example of trauma and violence breeding violence. A Nightmare on Elm Street got a remake in 2010, and in this version, any sort of nuance and vagueness about what Freddy did is lost. There, Freddy is guilty. Oh, and he's also a child molester. This aspect of Freddy's character is only hinted at in the original, although Craven did have it in mind for the film. But again, this adds another layer to the horror. Trauma can be defined as an event the severity of which we are not aware of in the moment of it happening, but that will definitely haunt us later in life. Freddy represents an amalgamation of different types of trauma, and throughout the film, we see different ways of dealing with it. Freddy only appears in the character's dreams, where he kills them. Nightmares are frequent symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. As I have already mentioned, and as you probably already know, Nancy, Glenn, Rod, and Tina represent the core group that we follow in this film. All four of them have had nightmares about Freddy. Of course, then they did not know who Freddy Krueger was, and some of them never actually find out. However, they are surprised that they all dreamt about the same person. One night, Tina's parents leave her all alone in the house, so Nancy, Glenn, and Rod come over to keep her company. Again, we see the parents' negligence. Why would you leave a whole ass child alone in a big ass house like that? Tina, in the beginning of the film, turns to religion, waking up after yet another nightmare, grabbing a crucifix. Similarly to this, people will often seek help and refuge in a religion when going through tough times, especially when not knowing how or where they can get adequate help. However, the same way that it does not actually help solve issues in real life, a religion does not help Tina either. Tina is Freddy's first victim in the film, and she's also the first person that verbalized her fears about her dreams. Even though she did ask for her friend's company and help, due to the lack of knowledge on Freddy, she ends up getting killed. We can compare this to the people that aren't well informed about their problems, due to which they end up dying. Tina was sort of a necessary fatality in the film. In order for our final girl, Nancy, to survive, Tina needed to die. Her death is the first that helps Nancy better understand what she's going up against. Understanding the different symptoms of PTSD, or simply dealing with trauma, can positively impact a person's life. We can also expand this to pretty much any problem. Where on one hand, Tina was asking for help to deal with her dreams, Rod, her boyfriend, does not do that. His willful ignorance, caused by, I would say, his attempt at a macho personality, leads to his death. In heavily patriarchal societies, you'll find that things like mental health and emotions are ignored as valid, especially when it comes to men. Like, let me just remind you that a little over a century ago, things like female hysteria were valid diagnoses in the medical field, and we're not that far off from ideologies that led to that. Unlike Tina, Rod is not even able to fight against Freddy, because he does not want to admit it to himself that he has a problem, even though he saw what happened to Tina, and he also had nightmares about Freddy. Freddy hanged Rod while he was asleep, which to the rest of the world seemed like a suicide by hanging. Suicide is sadly also present within people that suffer with PTSD, especially in those cases where it's not even diagnosed. Glenn, much like all of the other teens, had nightmares about Freddy. Due to his closeness to Nancy, throughout the film he helps her learn as much as she can about dreams. He watches her while she sleeps when she asks him to, and he tells her that he's ready to wake her up if it seems that she's being attacked. He, of course, does not do this. He falls asleep while he's with Nancy, somewhat showing that he does not take her fears about the severity of their problem seriously. Glenn, just like Rod, ignores their problem, and as I've mentioned, I would say that the influence of the patriarchal society they're a part of is the reason behind their deaths. At the beginning of the film, when Glenn is at Tina's, he lies to his parents that he's at his cousin's, showing us that they're quite overprotective. However, when Nancy warns Glenn's parents that he's in danger, they ignore her and he dies. So again, because of parents' negligence when needed, another kid dies. The trauma that they left their kid to deal with, that they ignored and did not try to help him with, ended up killing the kid that they tried oh so hard to protect. At times, Glenn finds Nancy's ideas funny. A man chasing you in your dreams, and if he catches you and kills you, you really die. If the film were edited differently, we could easily take Len's side. Tina was killed by Rod, which made him kill himself after, which led to Nancy having nightmares. Actually, that's exactly how Nancy's and Glenn's parents viewed the whole situation. Craven could have easily played with us, the viewers, making us question the reality of the film and obviously Nancy's sanity too. But no, he puts us side by side with Nancy. We know what the problem is. At first, we don't know how to solve it. But nobody believes us because they cannot see what we see. Kind of like trauma, right? At one point in the film, Nancy pulls out Krueger's hat out of her dream, finding out his name as well. Because of this, Nancy's mom reveals the story of who Krueger is and what happened to him. However, even after this event, both of Nancy's parents ignore Nancy's sometimes quite literal calls for help. Another way of dealing with trauma that this film presents is alcoholism, seen with Nancy's mom, Marge. I hope I don't have to explain why alcoholism or any sort of substance abuse, addiction, etc. are bad ways of coping with problems, and just in general are bad. However, they are frequent and sadly normalized nowadays, sometimes even glorified. Marge, of course, gets killed at the end of the film, being Freddy Krueger's only adult victim. The symbolism here is obvious. Alcoholism and similar vices do not resolve your problems. They worsen them most of the time. Nancy is different to all the other characters. As the final girl, throughout the Nightmare film, Nancy fights with Krueger, both directly and indirectly. She reads about dreams, she talks to others about her dreams, she demands people take her seriously. Realizing that she can pull things out of her dream, she comes up with a plan on how to deal with Freddy. She'll fall asleep, she'll fight him there, and then she'll try to pull him out of her dream. This she succeeds at. Before that, she filled the house with booby traps against Freddy. Just like with trauma, once Freddy comes out into the real world, meaning when it's quote-unquote real, the problem it presents is easily solved. Nancy is the only character in this film that survives Freddy's attacks, because at no point in the film did she give up, even when he had the upper hand. She fought against her trauma even when others thought that she was crazy. The moment when she beats Freddy is when she turns her back to him and tells him that she is not afraid anymore. After facing her trauma, after having literal battle scars, Nancy beats Freddy by leaving him behind her and taking all the power away from him. Much like most horror films, A Nightmare on Elm Street was expected to have a sequel. Thus, sadly, that final scene exists. If you've seen the film, you know that it has no logical relation to anything else we've seen previously. So Nancy leaves her house, her mother is there too, and in a car out front, there's Glenn, Rod, and Tina waiting for her. When Nancy enters the car, Freddy takes control of it, and an obvious doll, Marge, gets pulled into the house. Even though this last scene is often criticized by the fans, or really anyone that's seen the film, and even though Craven himself did not want to have this scene filmed, the scene itself can represent another allegory of trauma. It can never actually leave us. It's always there, even when we're not aware of it.